cousin is an Anglican priest, or just below a priest. I think she's a padre. I don't know quite where that sits, but she serves in the context of armed forces. And she,
chaplain sort of.
yeah, something like that. And she still performs some of the more sort of services and rituals and things like that. But one of the things she did on the site where she's based, she has one of these pod things that people have here as well, and she tows it around the site and says hello to people wherever they are, kind of thing. I think the previous person just sort of sat and waited for people who realized they needed something to come seek it out, but she just puts herself where people are, and then sort of things go from there. It's quite interesting hearing her talking about it, because she has a similar way of her own understanding of the tradition and things that are being asked. Some people still want the formal aspect, but then there's this sort of engaging in the midst of life that seems like a challenge that she's made a space for in some way. It's quite an interesting. It's an interesting image.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to catching up with it at some point to hear about that. Being in a similar role.
Yeah. One thing that came up was the roteness of ritual and of how you can lose touch with the meaning behind the words very quickly, and just caught up in, see them go through them really fast and just not really, hear the words.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be kind of a universal, in any kind of, maybe it's a human need. We did an exercise where we just paired up. I've never done anything like this in a service before, but we paired up and took one of the Psalms, and you would read 2 lines from the Psalm, and then think about how you would say it in long words, for maybe like 30 seconds, and then tell the person you paired up with, and then they would reciprocate with their 2 lines. And it was very interesting to experience it that way. And I've noticed when I do my own practice at home that I often find myself racing through the scriptures.
Sure.
Without really absorbing.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times I'll just sort of go back to where I noticed that I disconnected.
Sure. Yeah, that's really important.
And there's a funny thing that happens my observation anyway in synagogue, is that there's a certain competitiveness about how fast you can read the Hebrew, and yeah, particularly in an Orthodox setting where people are just racing through this stuff now, and it's like, third grader when it comes to never got that far into it. But I wonder, what do people get out of that? Other than feeling that they're good, or I don't know what people get.
So they're shoring up their identity instead of taking the opportunity to release it into greater.
Yeah.
So it is opposing. But on the other hand, they're maintaining a tether
Yeah.
of future opportunity.
And how would you apply that to reciting this 10,000 times type of...
Well, it has to be recited with connection to meaning, for sure. 10,000 times means completion. Completion isn't completed, if you're not open and connected. So it isn't necessarily 10,000 iterations. It's just might be 3, or it might be 3 of actual recitation in actual openness. So yeah, I think that reminder is always relevant. And keeping the pattern but changing the pattern in my teaching is directed at that to some extent. And so, doing the form without doing the form, or doing the form slightly differently, reading different scripture each time, different commentary each time, or sometimes the same commentary amounts to difference because it's usually different. Stillness beforehand and returning to stillness along the way, which is, I think, a way of saying, another way of describing the way you described your experience of noticing and then returning to where you lost the connection. Beginning in stillness establishes that connection. Returning to stillness returns to that connection. And of course, it's parallel to the sort of structure of the guided practice today in that stillness is preliminary. It's the goal, but it's also preliminary to practice. And so recitation is a form of cycling the chi. It has that's parallel in the body and in the forms that we practice.
I don't know, but I remember you talking about the 9 heavenly realms. Do you want to speak about
I'm sure I've read it at times in the scripture, but I'm not sure. The structure of 9 is a dividing into a fundamental pattern of different aspects and characters. Um, so it's similar to the pattern of the 8 trigrams, but includes a center. And if it's heavenly realms, the names will have one, be a set of names that are different than those same 9 patterns in a feng shui context. It would be the same kind of dividing, but different names. I don't have them memorized. I used to have a chart. I included them here on the wall. Don't. In the body, the upper dantian is considered divided in that way. Also, the 9 palaces in the upper dantian have their association with the 9 heavens. But also the one we refer to, the Niwan muddy pellet, or the clay pill, I think is a better translation, is the central of those 9 palaces. And so, like, for example, that central is behind the eyebrow heart of the third eye and below the crown, where those 2 axes meet. But in front of that is the third eye. I forget the name of the palace, but it's a sort of 1 inch by 1 inch-ish area just in front of the center. So in the head, where are those locations?
Like where the pineal gland resides? Area.
Mm-hmm.
I've had a desire this past week to divide myself in many parts and do all the things I want to do in a short period of time. And then with that, feeling this longing for time bending. And but then also the richness of sitting still, which is like non-doing. It's such a, that letting go aspect is so deep. Fulfilling. also noticed that November 8th was Friday?
Yeah, this year it was the 7th, was the first day of winter.
Oh, okay.
So it varies
Okay.
by a day or two in either direction.
And I think it was Friday where I walked out of my door in the morning and there was like just these really disparate snowflakes.
Oh, yeah.
And it says minor snow. I like the, I
Yeah.
was like, minor snow. Yeah, that was kind of what that day was like.
My birthday was the 6th. And for a long time, there were a bunch of years living in the Northeast between like 12 years old and 20 or something. The first snow was on my birthday.
Hmm.
So I indulged in some sort of...
Celebration?
No, just that adolescent sort of relationship to destiny where you think it's about you.
Snow on your birthday.
Not make it, but yeah, a version of that, allowing it to have meaning.
Mhm. The sky is celebrating me.
That's right. So for these open sessions, you're all welcome to either toss something out beforehand, but more likely, bring something from your study from any time, but potentially since we last were together. That you want to talk about in the group or ask questions about. I've been tending to communication so much, but if I were to, I would remind you beforehand.
Thinking about the naming in the scripture in relation to deities or spirits, especially when we were talking so much about the opening the mystery part last week. And I was just, I guess, seeing the kind of recitation of the scripture with an altar focus and with a musical accompaniment in China. There's a very clear sense of an address being made. But I was thinking of, sort of just wandering around the naming aspect as well as that being a naming that's addressed towards spirit and something. So with Yuan Shi, I think it's sort of as that aspect of originary commencement, something kind of an initial appearance or something like that. But it's also held as a name in the translation. and I presume also refers to a specific entity or
Mhm.
something like that. But just thinking through that, just sort of understanding it for oneself in the way you're describing it, another form of scripture, but also beginning to, or leaving space open for that form being part of that as well.
Mhm.
That's the thing that's been coming up throughout the week.
So it's not, I don't do it the same yet throughout the scripture, but the translation, but in translating it's always a question because part of the challenge as an English language participant in the Taoist path is that any translations always translate these very pivotal terms differently, and so then you don't recognize them from one context to the next. And so in most of those cases here, I've tried to leave the Chinese names so that when we encounter them, either in another context, we can, if they've made a respectful presentation, they've noted either the Chinese or the pinyin, and we can say, oh, that's what this is. So that's the sort of practical side of your question. And so the names, of course, are meaningful, and they can be understood as the meaning of the name. So Yuenshu is the name of an entity, as you say, but it is the original initiatory commencement. You know, that both those aspects are simultaneous and true. And then some have a or all really, but also have an aspect of their relationship in the tradition. So whether it's part of the sort of framework of the consortium of different personalities and roles among these deities, which I think we can accurately see as distinct energetic patterns. So there's a lot more to know than I know in how in the scriptural tradition the richness of each of these names, you know, and so I have some limited to definition sense, whereas, you know, Master Ju or Master Zhong at the temple would have this much richer narrative tapestry that goes with each name. My understanding tends to be limited to the meaning of the name and the role in, like, the three purities or the three, you know, some sort of arrangement that is knowable. But there's also this rich tapestry of narrative out there somewhere.
my inclination was to almost feel out the words behind that name, so as to sort of approach the sense that's in there, and I didn't want to sort of do that in a way that was extracting something from the text in some sort of way.
Yeah, so
Just
that
trying to balance that.
90% of the time that's going to be accurate, even with one of the common obstacles in translating the incantations is that generals Gonglu and Dao their names have meanings that are relevant, but they seem to be privileging the narrative orientation. And so, but I might, in a subsequent translation, revert to the celestial net version of those names that fill out the understanding of.
Do you know if in the history of Taoism, if the idea of if the deities and local gods and so on that are referenced were subsumed by teachers or, proselytizers, I don't know what you call it, of Taoism as a way of being inclusive, or if they, it's sort of, was it top down or bottom up versus?
I think both. It's adapting to existing, It's, you have a name for this here, I understand that name, I can use that name. But also that has the potential to misunderstand the arrival of Taoism in a local folk shamanism context as from outside, whereas maybe more likely that it's someone who went away and came back, brought these ideas and practices. And so the local gods and religious narrative constructs would have been natural in that person already. And so not necessarily a strategic integration from the outside in order to make it palatable, but more of that, I imagine it more in that kind of pattern that I just described. So, trader going away and coming back. And, bringing this other matrix. These two teas are very different, but they have a kind of overlapping sweetness.
I don't know if there's more to be said in relation to this, but last week we sort of stayed at length with talismans, and at one point you said that there's a way in which it's a person acting as a kind of mediator, a conduit for a pact between heaven and earth. And I think you said something about fixing a moment, and the talisman as being the, if I understood rightly, the kind of form in which that moment resides. And just looking at the scripture that you have there, there's a sense of spirit constantly sort of returning to, and dwelling in and taking refuge in the scripture as something that is constantly kind of generative and revealing something. And I'm intrigued if there's sort of two, especially in light of what has come out of the work of translating the scripture, if there are two very distinct ways in which symbols operate in those modalities. I was going to say language, but talismans aren't language, but sort of language-like in that way that you described. But just a kind of sense of what it entails to translate something that is effectively never fixed, or at its best, if you're able to retain that constant generativity. Just curious about that.
So I would say that they are in most ways not distinct, the talisman and scripture. fixing of a moment can help us understand kind of the action of writing or ingesting talisman. But it's not distinct, it's not separate from the perpetually revealing aspect of the scripture. Scriptures are kind of received, revealed, but the word received helps you see how it's the stamp in a similar way. And parallel to all writing and all speech, but just essentialized. I mean, there's a way in which all speech or expression is received in that imprinting way. But listening for the tether to the source is much harder in non-essentialized expression. Yeah. And I think the trick in translating is kind of the same thing Phil was talking about with respect to recitation, which is maintaining that connection as you find your way to a coherent construct for a word, a line, a verse, or a poem, or a canon. And then hopefully it gives the opportunity for the new language words to carry the spirit through.
Funny when you analogy, thinking of people who are extremely didactic is the word, but trying to hit you over the head with a message, and they're telling you about what the meaning of something in the Old and New Testament. Well, particularly thinking of the Old Testament, which a lot of it was Aramaic or Hebrew, and so far from English translations, which then somebody is trying to belabor into making a point.
A very singular point.
Yeah. And then they're citing this, translation as the authority.
Right.
Getting pretty far off the track.
Yep.
At one point, and I still want to get back to doing it, I was taking the names of the parts of three sources from Master Wu's Cosmic Orbit, and trying to do something sort of poetic with using his choice of a name for each part of the form, and as a jumping off point, and then but trying to incorporate all the I don't know if there were connotations or, but he referenced a word or a part of a word and all the meanings that were associated with it, but of course are the set of meanings that he chose, and there are probably a lot of others. And I think, it would be interesting as a sort of poetic exercise, but certainly could be, so far off the track as to be hilarious. But it'd be fun to try and see what we come up with.
Yeah.
And then my next step would be to try to associate some music with it. So, percolating.
During the practice, did you find that each of you, that your internal experience was following a similar pattern to what I was describing? Or did you find you were needing to generate a little bit, imagine it a bit?
Are you asking if we had to supply something to generate?
If you found that
your
if you found you were there when the words were happening, or whether you're using the words as a cue to imagine.
the letter for me. The previous time we did something like that, it was more clear.
Mhm.
Today I did.
Yeah.
I don't think it had a whole lot to do with what you were doing. It was just where I was today.
Sure.
I would agree. I mean, I think I went back and forth, but I would say, well, I feel like it's just. I mean, I feel that you're holding a space, and this space is a container. But then I think I come with whatever I come with,
Sure.
all the things, facets of self.
I find the sensation of heat is less available when I'm not well slept.
Mm.
And so the feeling of stillness was definitely there, but less locally, like when you were
Mm.
up here. Or,
Mm.
the stillness that's usually underlying that was present, but less that the sort of specific sensation. Even here was
Sure.
present.
And that's where imagination had come over because I didn't feel that sensation.
Yeah. Definitely really shifted my, sometimes there's more held, it's not even activity, but sort of even physical tension. And I think even just being like directed there definitely helped feel a kind of release and opening for me in this instance. It's really useful.
I had a somewhat similar experience to last week in that the sort of transition in was slow. So last week with the repetition of the very first part of the form, sort of yang rising, it took that time to actually settle in that sensation, which then kind of presented itself as already having been there. I just hadn't been attuned to it. And similarly, as we kind of traced the trajectory of the heat, it became more apparent to me that it was there. Whereas at first I was kind of looking for it. And then by the time it was sort of all the way up, sort of rising up the spine, then it felt very distinctly attuned. And at the end I had a kind of strange sensation that I haven't had before, as though there were eyes behind my eyes. And of a kind of very central point within my skull, but without a kind of sensation of perimeter. But it's always sort of interesting to notice this kind of, as though of a surprise presence of something. It's there all along. But just the kind of fineness of settling on it.
You pointed out, you mentioning areas and places of potential heat or movement, for me, served to it was all happening. So I was very, my mind was / body were very, there's a lot of movement in my sit today. I was very much here, or in a place, a not distracted place, but I would have lots of movement of like energy and feelings and thoughts moving through me the whole time, and it didn't settle until the very end. But the heat was there pretty quickly, and movement was, was there, and as far as a rising of heat, and the breath, I didn't have a didn't have as much of a connection to our breath holds, or the way we did our breath today. So it didn't generate anything for me, today's breaths. But I did already have a lot of heat generated.
Yep.
But because it was kind of it was a new approach, and I was in this space of lots of my own internal energetic movements, it was harder for me to connect with it right away.
I had sort of the opposite feeling in that it was a bit like you were describing, Phil, the kind of habit of reading the scripture can also be a sort of habit of sitting. And so there was a sense of, I know what I'm doing right now, I'm sitting. And then once you started to describe heat rising, I was like, oh, I'm doing the form, I'm not sitting. So there was a way in which that, dropping that in displaced the regular pattern and sense of kind of familiarity of things. So, I mean, I guess in a way it sort of was unfamiliar, but also felt very gentle.
But yeah, that was my experience. I guess I was, as distracted as I was, I realized the form was happening. The heat was there, the movement was there, and I almost didn't like the breath, the breathing and the sounds almost, it was just happening. And it was a matter of whether I was in it or not.
I had this feeling when you started even that I could sneak in a couple of hongs very quietly just to kind of catch my furnace and get it relit. You know. Somebody tripped the circuit breaker. I thought that would be distracting. So maybe I'll just try to catch a ride here. I'm still working on a name for your road, Tupper. That was part of my...
Maybe that was my problem.
Yeah, I've got one now, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Claypole Road. I think that'll be a great name. I have a hard time selling it to the people online. Or to yourself.
How about the road of sincerity?
So in that kind of guided practice, it's this aspect is more obvious, but it's also true. And I'm about to say, the more apparently kind of physical, structural guiding through that I sometimes do. That it's the role of the words is like the commentary on the scripture, in the sense that the goal is to constantly return to or circle around the relationship to the essence, and also therefore the view. And so reminding type commentary in the scripture of the relationship to both body and to structure of reality frameworks, when the words are talking about a narrative situation with a deity and blessing land or something like that, to pull those into essence always, while participating in the narrative aspect, is also our relationship to practice, which has this narrative aspect with these points that we travel through. But each of those points has the opportunity to be tethered to essence in this way that creates the conditions for opportunities of awakening. And so each of these little slightly different journeys through the same territory, I hope will populate your mindscape and carry with you as you practice. And they can all be there simultaneously, whether you're whole or whether you're just open and still. For all of these to layer and refract one another into a single beam of bright white light is the goal.
What you were just saying just reminded me of this, the thesis of Adyashanti. He's a spiritual teacher, and he has a book called Resurrecting Jesus. I'd say the thesis of that story is that, well, he's speaking of the Jesus story, but I think his point is also just in life to put ourselves into the story and just to look for a metaphor, and so that we can have a known sense of understanding.
Kind of a heart relationship to it.
Mhm.
Yeah, just like that.
Well, if I'm understanding what you were saying, that you're trying to broaden the context. Or embroider the tapestry, to use that metaphor, but you haven't spoken against, wrote anything. I will say that there is a value, I do see a value, I don't think it's all bad, to a certain, to the roteness of the form, in that it creates a set of triggers.
Yep.
And, that can anchor
Yep.
what you're doing, which, particularly on a bad day, can kind of put you back where you want to be.
Yeah, definitely.
So,
Yeah.
that's okay too. That's,
Oh, absolutely. No, it's not just okay, it's essential. Yeah. Yeah.
in a way, what you were doing today was sort of like, taking 30 seconds to reflect on what was written in a translation of a psalm. It kind of takes you away from customary triggers
Mhm.
in a useful way.
Mhm.
And those could become triggers, I think,
Mhm.
through practice of thinking that way. But on the first iteration or so, maybe that's part of what was extra work for me, that was putting it more into my head
Mm.
in the negative sense. that-
Sure.
So I'm saying, don't stop doing it. I think it's a good thing. Certainly deepens experience.
let's wrap. Hot water is expired. Thank you all.